In the third bar, we introduce then a left hand that goes along with it. So the first two bars are just E, G, and B. And then the piece actually starts, that's more or less an introduction. Then we introduce left hand element to it. So we're playing two notes in the left hand with E and B in the bass. We have a bass ostinato, a repeated figure, which goes over and over through the entire piece in the bass, with two note patterns in the left hand. Now, another common problem that people have when they're playing a chord, 3 or 4 note chord or a 2 note chord, is that they put their fingers down and they have their fingers, they think, correctly, but they're getting a very funny sound. For instance, in bar 5, we have an E in the bass, C, and E, this figure. So we have E bass, C, and E. Now when you do this, you might get a sound like this. You can't figure out what's wrong because you have your first finger down, and your open string is just open, and your bass string. But for some reason, that upper string isn't sounding. The reason for that is that your finger is probably not on the tip, and part of your finger is probably hanging over a bit and touching that string. So you see, if it's on its tip, the note is clear. But as the finger comes down, it blocks that note. Maybe just a bit, so you get a buzz, or it completely stops that note. So again, here's the value in playing on the tips of your fingers. You have to be able to play on one string and one only, so that your finger isn't touching any other strings. Also in this piece, it's important that you follow the left-hand fingering carefully. There's a few different type patterns which you may not be used to. There's one that goes like this, where we have A and C sharp, and then we go with those same fingers to C sharp and F sharp. And so we move those fingers as a unit, 3 and 4 together. Again, if you're having problems with something like that, make an exercise out of it. First of all, playing it in its simplest form, maybe exactly as it's written, and then adding. Again, in this case, you could add a rhythmic element. That might be the most obvious thing right at the beginning. You might go. In this case, what you might also want to do is play it on different strings. You might also want to go up the fingerboard. Or, even more difficult now, you might want to leap, rather than just stay on the same fret, leap a fret ahead. So rather than just leaping down to here, going to the next two, I jump up a fret, and then up a fret again, then up a fret. See, that adds another difficulty. So you see then, by making it more difficult than is what's in the piece, when you actually come back then to play what's in the piece, you say, well, this is quite simple now, because you've mastered something even more difficult. And again, what that does is increases your technical capacities, and your technique develops further and further. So I'll play the piece for you now, and watch my left hand and the right hand. Notice some of the changes. And also, as in every piece, take careful note of the left hand and right hand fingering. You'll notice if you listen carefully that not only was I just playing the notes right through, but that the dynamics were changing, the volume was changing. So you might at this point start thinking a bit about that. We won't get into that very much at this point, but just listen. You might find that by doing the repeat a bit different. First time loud, second time a bit quiet. Or you might find that when we go from the first section to the second section, it has a different quality. One's a bit brighter, the rest of it's quite dark. So you might find you want to play the dark part maybe a bit softer, then come out when it gets bright. Start adding a bit of expression. Think, how does this piece strike me? How do I feel about the piece? Because the idea is not only that you're playing maybe only for your own benefit, but if you're playing for somebody else, it's nice to be able to communicate how you feel about the piece. And the only way to do that is through your personal interpretation, so that everybody that would play this piece would play it slightly different. The next piece is somewhat the same, using the three-note chord pattern that we've talked about. In this case, what we have is chords on top with a melodic bass line. Slightly different from the last piece where the bass was just doing an ostinato, repeating itself, and the upper voices had the melodic content. In this case, the upper voices are adding their harmonic content, the accompaniment, and the bass line has all the melodic interest. I'll play it first once for you, and then we'll look into a few of the difficulties that you may come across in this piece. So you can hear how the bass line is very melodic, and the upper notes are the chordal accompaniment. This piece has interesting left-hand fingering, so take careful note of it. The reason for the fingering, for the most part, which may seem a bit unorthodox in certain cases, is so that we can hold the upper voices. The upper notes are all dotted half notes. Now you have to be careful and listen very carefully that they actually ring through for the full value, that you don't cut them off. For instance, in the first bar, you may have a tendency to do this. You see, you might lift up your fingers and just cut off those notes, but they should be ringing. Second bar. Third bar. So you can hear how those upper notes, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, they ring right through. So you have to be very careful. You'll find more and more as we're playing 2- and 3-part music that in each voice, since they're almost independent entities, they have a life of their own. So you can't ignore them and just pay attention to whatever happens to be predominant. Just because it's the bass line, it's no less important than the melodic line. So pay very careful attention to the note values and make sure you hold them for their full value. Some of the left-hand fingering is the way it is because it simplifies things. In other words, in certain cases, like in the first bar, on the third note, we have your fourth finger. We have a 4 there. And then we go to 4 here with 2 and 3. Okay? Now in that second bar, if we were to use a third finger, which, we said F first finger, D third finger, then to play that E and F in the bass line, we'd have to do something like that, okay? Which is more difficult than doing this. That's much easier. It also makes a smoother line. Rather than jumping with one finger, if we can use two, it makes that line, the bass line, flow more smoothly. So a lot of the fingering is for that reason. As much as possible, you don't want to leap with one finger to the next finger. You want your pieces to sound legato, which means connected, which is a very difficult thing to do in the beginning. You might find that when you're playing, everything sounds quite choppy. You have plump, plump, plump. And every beat is sort of its own entity and has no relationship to the next. In this case, that melodic line, you want it to sing as much as possible. In other words, it's almost as if you were singing the piece. You might want to sing along, actually. And just find that when you sing it, the notes connect. But when you play it in the guitar, you might get this sound. And everything is sort of disjointed. So think in terms of connecting that. So that that bass line is almost singing to itself. Now let's play the Etude once more.